You have until Monday to surrender access to that lake, or we will file for injunctive relief. That was the message on the voicemail. Not a hello, not a name, just a threat delivered with the calm authority of someone who has never once been told no. I was standing in the driveway of a property I had owned for 11 days, surrounded by boxes I had not finished unpacking, and a woman I had never met was already telling me what I was going to give up. Patricia Holt, president of the Lakeview Shores Homeowners Association, had no idea what was already sitting inside a banker's box in my spare bedroom. Documents my late aunt had spent 40 years assembling with the quiet patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Documents that didn't just answer Patricia's demand, they inverted it completely. But before I tell you how those documents ended Patricia Holt's 10-year reign over a lakefront community, drop a comment below. Have you ever inherited a situation that turned out to be far more powerful than you realized? And tell me where you're watching from, because HOA stories unite us across every zip code and time zone. Let me start at the beginning. My name is Daniel Rourke, 42 years old, recently retired from 20 years as a civil engineer, and the unlikely heir to 4 acres of lakefront property in rural Tennessee that my Aunt Ruth had owned since 1979. I'd visited maybe a dozen times as a kid, remembered the dock, the smell of lake water on summer mornings, the way the light came off the surface at dusk. What I didn't know was the legal architecture my aunt had quietly constructed around that property across 4 decades of careful, methodical record-keeping. Ruth Rourke had never married, never had children, and had spent her professional life as a paralegal. She understood documents the way a surgeon understands anatomy, not just what they said on the surface, but what they meant 3 layers down, where the language got precise and the implications ran deep. When she died at 78, she left me the property, a handwritten letter explaining almost nothing about what I was inheriting, and that banker's box. The letter said only this: "The lake is yours, Daniel. All of it. Read everything in the box before you talk to anyone." I did not read everything in the box before I talked to anyone. I was grieving. I was moving. I had 47 other things demanding attention, and the box sat on a shelf for the first week while I concentrated on getting the water heater working and finding where the circuit breaker was labeled wrong. That was the week Patricia Holt found out I had arrived. She came to the door on a Tuesday morning with a leather portfolio under her arm and the expression of someone delivering a verdict rather than introducing themselves. Mid-60s, athletic, the kind of precisely assembled appearance that communicates that your time is never wasted and hers is never available. She handed me a welcome packet that was approximately 60% disclosure forms and explained, in the crisp professional tone of someone who has given this speech many times, that Lakeview Shores had community standards, that my property's lakefront access was subject to shared use provisions, and that the HOA had been managing recreational access to the water for the past 9 years. I thanked her for stopping by and told her I'd look through everything. What she left behind was a claim, not aggressive yet, just a claim that the lake access my property sat on was governed by easement agreements that made it communal resource, managed by the association, subject to their scheduling and their approval. She mentioned kayak launch times. She mentioned a committee that reviewed dock modifications. She mentioned that my aunt's boat slip had been grandfathered under a previous arrangement, but that some aspects of the current usage needed to be formalized. Everything she said was delivered in the language of procedure and reasonableness. Nothing she said was actually reasonable. That evening, I opened the banker's box. Ruth had organized it with the precision of someone who expected it to be used under pressure, under time constraints, possibly under legal challenge. Color-coded folders, a handwritten index on the inside cover of the lid, a separate envelope labeled "Read First" in her small, deliberate handwriting. The envelope contained a 2-page summary that she had apparently updated annually, the last revision dated 8 months before she died. It explained, in the plain language of someone who had spent decades translating legal complexity for other people, exactly what she owned and exactly what it meant. The lake was not communal. It was not shared. It was not subject to HOA governance under Tennessee water law. The deed to Ruth's property included riparian rights extending to the center line of the lake, which in combination with 2 adjacent parcels she had quietly acquired in 2003 and 2011 meant that she held majority ownership of the lake surface itself, not access to the lake, not frontage on the lake, the water. More specifically, the original plat for the Lakeview Shores subdivision, filed in 1987, had allocated dock easements, the legal right to maintain and use boat docks on the water, through a series of recorded agreements that all pointed back to the same source: Ruth's property. Every dock in the community, all 23 of them, existed because Ruth had granted easements that she had the legal right to grant, and which she had the legal right to modify or revoke under conditions specified in the original documents. Patricia Holt's HOA had been managing lake access for 9 years. They had been doing it on property and under rights that belonged entirely to my aunt, and now they belonged to me. I sat with this information for several days before I called anyone. The engineering part of my brain kept running the same calculation: understand the full structure before you move anything. I hired a local real estate attorney named Carol Finch, who specialized in Tennessee water rights. She spent a week reviewing Ruth's documents and then called me on a Thursday afternoon with the particular tone of someone delivering news they want to make sure lands correctly. "Daniel," she said, "your aunt was meticulous. Everything is current, everything is filed, and everything is exactly what it appears to be." Carol walked me through the implications methodically. The dock easements Ruth had granted were revocable with 90 days written notice under specific conditions, including material changes in usage patterns which the HOA's 9 years of managing and monetizing lake access clearly represented. The riparian ownership meant that the HOA's kayak launch schedules, their boat ramp fees, their recreational permits, all of it had been operating as though they held authority they had never actually possessed. I asked Carol what the HOA had been collecting in fees related to lake access. She pulled the public filings and called me back the next morning. Over 9 years, the Lakeview Shores HOA had collected approximately $340,000 in lake access fees, launch permits, and dock registration charges. Fees collected on rights that belonged to Ruth, and now to me, without any compensation, any acknowledgement, or any disclosure to the people paying them. This was when Patricia Holt stopped being a nuisance and became a legal problem. The voicemail about injunctive relief came on a Friday. Patricia had apparently heard from someone in the community that I had been seen with an attorney, which in a small lakefront neighborhood travels faster than weather. Her tone had shifted from the measured procedural language of our first meeting into something harder, still technically professional, still framed as community standards, but carrying the unmistakable edge of someone who understood that a challenge was forming and wanted to get ahead of it. I listened to it twice, wrote down the exact words, and sent a copy to Carol. Carol's response was a single line of text: "Let me handle the first communication." What Carol sent Patricia was a letter. Not aggressive, not threatening, just precise. 11 paragraphs of legal precision that walked through the chain of title, the riparian rights, the dock easement structure, and the specific provisions governing revocation. The letter did not demand anything, it did not make any threats, it simply described with complete accuracy what existed. It was the legal equivalent of turning on a light in a room someone had been navigating in the dark for 9 years. Patricia did not respond for 5 days. During those 5 days, I learned from my neighbor Alan, who had lived on the lake for 12 years and had his own complicated feelings about the HOA, that Patricia was in emergency meetings, that she had consulted the association's attorney, that she had pulled out the original easement documents, apparently for the first time in several years, and had discovered that what Carol's letter described was accurate. Alan also told me something I had not known. The HOA had been in active negotiations with a resort developer for the past 18 months. The developer wanted to build a boutique waterfront hotel on a parcel adjacent to the lake and had been in discussions about securing guaranteed water access and dock rights as part of the project. The deal, according to Allen, was supposedly worth somewhere between $4 and $6 million to the community, spread across property value increases, developer payments, and a promised renovation of community facilities. Every element of that deal required clean title to the lake access rights. Rights that belonged to me. Patricia Holt had not been collecting fees and managing schedules as a power trip, though there was clearly some of that. She had been positioning the HOA's assumed authority over the lake as an asset she could leverage for the largest transaction the community had ever seen, and she had been doing it without disclosing to any of her neighbors that the authority she was representing was not actually hers to represent. Carol and I discussed options for a full day. I want to be clear about what I was and was not willing to do. I had no interest in evicting anyone from their dock. These were people's homes, their boats, their summer mornings on the water. Revoking 23 dock easements to watch a neighborhood scramble would have made me the villain in a story that did not require one. That was not what I was building toward. What I was building toward was accuracy. The community deserved to know the truth about what had been collected on their behalf and where it had gone. They deserved to know about the resort deal and who had been negotiating it without their knowledge. And Patricia deserved to answer for 9 years of operating as though she held rights that belonged to someone else. I asked Carol to request a full financial accounting of all lake-related fee collections and disbursements. A legitimate HOA with clean books should have had no difficulty producing this. Patricia's attorney requested a 2-week extension, then another. When the partial accounting finally arrived, it listed total collections accurately enough but described disbursements in categories so vague they were essentially meaningless: lake management, community infrastructure, recreational programming. Carol filed a formal demand for itemized documentation. 3 days later, we received a counterproposal. Patricia, through her attorney, offered to acknowledge my riparian rights in exchange for a formal transfer of easement management authority to the HOA, a release of any claims related to prior fee collections, and this was the piece that confirmed everything. My signature on a letter of support for the resort development agreement. She was not trying to resolve a dispute, she was trying to bury one. I declined. What followed over the next 6 weeks was a textbook escalation that Carol had warned me was likely. Patricia organized an emergency community meeting, which she described to residents as an opportunity to address challenges to our community's lakefront heritage. I was not invited. She created a neighborhood communication group to distribute information about what she called an outside investor attempting to restrict residents' water access, a framing that transformed her unauthorized fee collection into my aggression. She sent a letter to the resort developer, apparently attempting to assure them the title questions were minor and resolvable. I know this because the developer's attorney contacted Carol directly, asking for clarification on the easement structure, and mentioned that the HOA president had been in contact. The developer was not unsophisticated. They pulled their own title review and put the negotiations on hold within a week. Patricia's deal was disintegrating, and she knew exactly whose banker's box had caused it. The breaking point came from inside the HOA, not from me. Tom and Sandra Adler, who owned the second largest dock structure on the lake and had been paying premium HOA fees for the right to maintain it, had been quietly reviewing the same public records Carol had walked me through. Tom was a retired accountant. He understood quickly and completely what the fee collection history meant when set against the actual ownership structure. He called me on a Tuesday evening, introduced himself with the directness of someone who had decided to stop waiting, and asked a simple question. How much of what we paid should have been going to your aunt? I told him I was not trying to recover anything from individual homeowners, that my dispute was with how the association had characterized and monetized rights it did not hold, that what I wanted was accuracy and accountability, not a battle with neighbors who had simply been paying fees they were told were legitimate. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Patricia told us the lake management fees were going into a reserve fund for infrastructure. I just pulled 3 years of bank statements. There is no reserve fund. There is a line item called Administrative Operations that has absorbed $180,000 in the past 3 years with no supporting documentation. He and Sandra began organizing, quietly, carefully, the way retired accountants and their neighbors organize, with spreadsheets, with documented requests, with the patient accumulation of specific questions that demand specific answers. Within 3 weeks, 11 of the 23 dock owners had signed a formal petition requesting a full independent audit of all HOA financial records and an emergency membership meeting to address what the petition described as material discrepancies in lake access fee accounting. Patricia could not block the meeting. The HOA bylaws required one upon petition by 30% of membership, and the signatures covered that threshold. She could only choose whether to attend it prepared or unprepared. She chose a third option, which was to resign 48 hours before the meeting was scheduled, citing personal health concerns, and to retain a criminal defense attorney the following morning. The meeting happened without her. Carol attended as my representative. Tom Adler facilitated. The new interim board president, a woman named Diane Marsh who had moved to the community 2 years earlier and had been quietly uncomfortable with Patricia's management style from the beginning, opened the meeting by distributing a summary of the ownership question that Carol had prepared, plain language, 2 pages, diagrams of the easement structure so people could see exactly what they were looking at. The room was quiet for most of the presentation. Not the hostile quiet of people defending positions, but the particular quiet of people recalibrating. What I proposed through Carol was this. I would maintain all existing dock easements for current owners at no charge, formalized and updated agreements that accurately reflected the ownership structure. The HOA could continue to manage recreational scheduling and common facility maintenance with the scope of their authority properly defined and documented. Any future commercial development discussions involving lake access rights would require my participation and consent, and any proceeds from such discussions would be distributed equitably among all waterfront property owners rather than directed through association accounts without member visibility. In exchange, I was not seeking restitution from individual homeowners for past fees. I was requesting that the financial irregularities identified in the accounts be referred to the appropriate authorities, which the new board agreed to do before the meeting ended. The resort developer, once the title questions were formally resolved with clear documentation, re-engaged. The project has since moved forward with a structure that distributes development rights compensation to all 23 dock owners as individuals, not through the association's operating fund. Each family received a check the following spring that averaged just over $12,000. Tom and Sandra Adler, with their larger dock structure, received slightly more. They used it to rebuild the dock entirely and sent me a photograph of the finished project with a note that said simply, "Thank you for making this accurate." My daughter Sophie visited for the first time 6 weeks after the meeting, on a Saturday in October when the light on the lake was doing exactly what I remembered from childhood. She walked the dock, watched the geese moving through the cove across the water, and asked me what my aunt had been like. I told her Ruth had been patient, that she had understood how to hold something carefully for a long time without gripping it too tightly, that she had known the value of documents and the importance of reading everything before you talk to anyone. Sophie looked out at the water. So she knew this was going to happen someday? I think she knew it might, I said, and she wanted to make sure whoever was holding it when it did would have everything they needed. The banker's box is still on the shelf in the spare bedroom. I have not moved it. Some things earn their place by what they contain, not by how they look. Patricia Holt is currently the subject of an ongoing financial investigation. I have not been asked to participate, and I have not volunteered. What happens in that proceeding is between her and the people whose fees she collected. My part of the story ended when the dock agreements were updated, the records were corrected, and the neighbors who had been paying for access to water that was never the association's to manage finally understood exactly what they owned and what they did not. If you're dealing with an HOA that seems to be operating on authority it cannot actually document, the most important thing I can tell you is this: pull the original plat. Find the recorded easements. Trace the chain of title back to the beginning and read it the way Ruth read everything. Not looking for what you hope to find, but looking for what is actually there. Sometimes what is actually there changes everything. Drop your HOA story in the comments. The more specific the better, because general frustration is common, but the details are where the real stories live, and the real stories are where the rest of us learn something useful. Subscribe if you want more of these, because we have several more coming that follow the same principle: ordinary people, extraordinary documents, and the particular satisfaction of accuracy defeating assumption. I'll see you in the next one.